Weddings are a special thing. Even in the midst of COVID, we've celebrated a couple of weddings here. And I know whether digitally or in person, there have been unforgettable moments in our church. Recently, we can think of Colin and Grace, who are here with us. We can think of Alvin and Jenny. Even myself and Pocha stood here. And I think many of the couples of our church, whether married in this building or perhaps the previous one, by God's providence, grace, and leading, celebrated a very, very special day with great joy in pomp and circumstance, and they're unforgettable moments. Kind of. Weddings are also one of the most stressful days you can go through in your life. For myself, I could say it was definitely one of the most tiring and overwhelming days, and then we did another one in Taiwan. And I know several of you in this room actually work very directly with weddings, whether taking pictures, doing wedding decorations, coordinating. And over COVID, several of you have run the AV and things during weddings. And so you get the behind-the-scenes look, where you know probably every single wedding, something doesn't quite go right. And not necessarily everyone will know, but those who are serving in the background know. And I still remember I was best man for one of my friends, and during the wedding reception, one of the rings dropped through a grate. And so they did not have a very peaceful dinner, realizing it took a couple of hours to figure out how to saw open the ground and get the ring out. Anyways, only a handful of people sometimes know. But in a sense, weddings are an incredibly special thing, but they can be this place of stress and obligation and a lot of details. And it's into this situation, an everyday situation of wedding, that Jesus, very early in his public ministry, makes himself known. But how? What do we learn about Jesus through the story that perhaps many of us are very, very familiar with? Well, we're looking at this story okay, let me try flipping on and off my clicker here. We are checking out this story in a new calendar season. I like to always remind us and show us again this graphic of where are we, and it helps us understand the themes of what's going on as a church as we worship together. Let me zoom in a little bit here. So, as I mentioned, we did our Advent series, think about light and darkness, where we are crying out to God, expecting him. We had a wonderful celebration of Christmas and a white Christmas on top of that as we remembered anticipating Jesus and then Jesus coming to us, known as incarnation. Well, we are on the second Sunday of Epiphany, and Epiphany is like to have a revelation, for something to come to light, to realize something. So one of the fundamental questions of Epiphany is simply, who is Jesus? Who is this Jesus? Who exactly is this Jesus? And the thing about who God is that God is something we always need to experience anew. No matter how much we may think we know about God, we don't. And Epiphany is a season that reminds us to continue to grow, continue to have this light in our eyes opened up to us. The light does shine in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Well, let's dive into the story. Who is this Jesus? Let's consider the setting and the story. On the third day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus was also invited to the wedding with his disciples. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." Well, what can we observe about this story? We find out Jesus' mother is actually mentioned first. So perhaps Jesus' mother is closer to the family. We're not exactly sure. But I think that order does matter, and Jesus' disciples are mentioned second. So maybe Jesus' disciples were a tag-along. I'm not sure. I don't know how many times you've gone to a wedding because your parents were invited, and you may know very little about either the families, or they may not be that significant to you, but you are there. We don't know if Mary had special responsibilities that day, but the fact that she didn't know about the situation, about the wine, which would have been very embarrassing for the families, suggests that perhaps Mary was one of these behind-the-scene helpers, which many of you have been at a part of a wedding when you realize, something isn't right, someone is late, this thing has not shown up, or there's a big problem. Well, this is what's happening. And so Mary says to Jesus, "There is no wine." This is a big deal. In ancient Jewish culture, a wedding might be one day, but more likely a wedding was in fact multiple days, even up to a week. And the hosting family was very important that they had sufficient wine and food to host everyone for the entire time. This can be a little bit harder for us to understand. I think our weddings nowadays are much more relaxed. I was trying to think of some equivalent situations for us. Maybe the best man forgetting the ring, okay, and somehow losing it. That could be this terrible sense of something's very, very wrong. Perhaps many Chinese families do a tea ceremony. It'd be one of the families forgetting the red pockets, and now they're sitting down about to do the tea ceremony, and it occurs to them, we forgot the gift, okay? Well, in Jewish culture, this could shame the entire family. And there's still many parts of the world where there is a huge obligation at a family wedding. I know in some cultures, even the one side of the family may have to prove they have a certain amount of money in the bank account to show that they can provide for the bride and their family. And many cultures have a formal dowry. And in Jewish culture, if you had made an obligation, i.e., I'm going to host this dinner or I'm going to provide this gift for the bride, you could actually be sued for not coming through on your side of the obligation. So there is a legal implication, but more than that, I think the humiliation of a major mess up at a wedding is more than enough punishment. And so wine running out is an important part of Jewish culture, was a huge problem here. Well, what happens as we continue to read? We find out about family relationships. Maybe sometimes we forget Jesus is really human, grew up as a child, had parents, and had to deal with all the things that happen between parent and child relationships, particularly mother and child relationships. I think this is actually quite cute if you read this quite carefully. They have no wine. Such an innocent statement. It would be like my mother saying to me, there's snow on the driveway, or this room is rather messy. And there's no question here, but I think all of us who grew up with parents know that a single statement may have much more implied meaning. So the mother, of all the people she could talk to, comes to Jesus and says, they have no wine. And what does Jesus say? Well, I don't know if Jesus was just a tag-along invitation or what, but he's like, what does this have to do with me? In the same way my mother might say, there's snow on the driveway, I might say, well, that's very nice. I don't believe this has any relationship to myself. But it seems that Jesus' mother, although a lot of people don't know who Jesus is or that he is the Son of God at this point, I think the mother knows something. She knows the prophecies about who this person is. So we see Jesus' response. He says, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. So Jesus actually says, my calling in my life, what God the Father has called me to, Mom, it's not time yet. I'm not actually supposed to do anything to draw attention or do any miracles. Now, we don't have the entire conversation here, but the mother basically assumes this is going to happen. And so she tells the servants, do whatever he tells you. This would be like my mom saying, oh yeah, the shovel's behind the door. I still haven't been asked to shovel the driveway, but I think we can all read in between the lines. And so the mother says to the servants, do whatever he tells you. Well, a mother's word can be a powerful thing. And despite Jesus thinking that he may have plans from the top, from God the Father, Jesus proceeds, whether out of love for his mom and his understanding of the wedding. Again, we just have a snippet of the conversation. I'm sure more was said. Perhaps the mother knew what this would cost the family or the potential shame or humiliation, but Jesus does in fact act. And he has these servants with him. And so the story continues. Now there were 6 stone water jars there for Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water. And they filled them. And then he said to them, now take some out and take it to the master of the feast. So they took it. Well, you might feel bad for Jesus as the mom is telling him to do things. I feel bad for the servants. Can you imagine how foolish this would have been? As a servant, you probably have some idea. Something is very, very wrong. And you receive this very, very foolish command, which is to draw water, take water and bring it to, other than the families, the most important person at the wedding feast, the master of the feast. Give him a cup of water. And this master of the feast might have some sign that something is very wrong. But the servants go ahead and do it. They are obedient. And what we find is the master of the feast tastes the water now become wine. And he wasn't aware of where it came from, though the servants were. And then he announces to everyone, you have done something amazing. Everyone else serves the nice stuff first, and as people kind of forget or have drunk a little bit, they're not going to notice if you pass off poor wine later. But the master of the feast says, you have done something special on this very special day. And then what we find out is, as John records this story, he says, this is the first of the signs Jesus did, where he manifested God's glory, the glory, and the disciples believed in him. Glory. You might think, this is just a small miracle, Jesus providing wine. Is this something of glory? Do we see the glory of Jesus here? Well, I want us to think a little bit about the layers of glory here. Is this simply a miracle of water to wine? I want to suggest there is a lot more going on here than simply water to wine. And I want to unpack what I think are some of the layers of glory we can see in this miracle. First, water for purification. You might have been wondering about that. What are these stone jars? Well, still, if you go to Asia and several of the temples, they have different purification rites. Maybe outside the temple, there'll be a big ladle of water and you use it to cleanse yourself. Well, Jews also had many, many rituals for purification. And from this, it was a sense of making yourself clean before God. Making yourself clean before God. Just as we did confession, Jewish people had certain rites that would help them have a sense of cleanliness before God. Well, how much more would one day the real wine that Jesus would bring, his own blood, purify us? And so this miracle of water to wine, this wine symbolizes and foreshadows a day where Jesus says, one day you will drink of a different wine that he provides for us. And so this jars of purification that John includes in his account, I don't think is a mistake. And also helps us remind us how much wine there was. It says each of these jars was 20 to 30 gallons. Well, that means Jesus brought about 300 to 500 liters of wine. I don't know if you can imagine that amount. I remember for our wedding for Pocha and myself, Reverend Paul lent us his dolly. And even each table might not look like it has much wine, but when you need to wheel in the amount of alcohol required at a large wedding, it is a lot. And here Jesus brings about 300 to 500 liters of not just any wine, but excellent, excellent wine. And this foreshadows the day that Jesus will provide his wine, his blood of forgiveness for not just 300 to 500 liters, but for the whole world. Jesus will come to purify us. Another layer of glory is healer-family relationships. Weddings bring up tension, different expectations, potential tension between in-laws. Sometimes a wedding can leave a feeling or bad blood that can cause all sorts of problems. Well, what Jesus does here, miraculously, is also help a married couple and these families get started on good terms. And any of us who've gone through family tension realize that is not a small thing. Jesus does not do a silly card trick. He does something that actually affects these people's lives and their families. And he makes mom happy. There's something to be said about making mom happy. And don't miss that layer of the story as well. A God of joy. I don't know what picture you imagine of Jesus. Do you imagine Jesus someone super serious who walks around and just says super serious things and that's it? Or do you imagine a Jesus who would dance at a wedding, who would shout with joy as they see the couple, and would help provide wine to make everyone's hearts merry around the table? I want to show you a brief clip here. And we had some problems about how well you can show it. This is the Chosen trying to illustrate what happens. This is Jesus, and you might be able to see the various stone jars around him. We might have to turn off the transparency. No, that's okay. Anyways, we find out in the Chosen, the way they describe it, Jesus finally says, "Father, I am ready." And as he reaches into the jar and pulls it out, you can't see that well here, but you see it dripping red. That is, the water has in fact turned to wine. And there's this great moment here, and I hope you'll be able to make it out a little bit. At home, it's actually easier. You see Jesus smile, and there's a sense of joy on his face as he realizes what God has done. let me go back to here. What God has done in this, what may seem like, kind of a silly miracle, turning water into wine, but the power of God at work, Jesus listening to his mother's suggestion about what he can do, and then bringing joy to this wedding celebration. This story reminds us that Jesus is a person of joy who celebrates, and that little smile, I think, is wonderfully done. Some people actually think the water to wine is the greatest of miracles. I'm not sure where you would rank it on all the things Jesus does. In the 18 and 1900s, there were many people who started doubting the Bible and thinking about who Jesus was. And one such person, David Strauss, actually tried to rank all the miracles of Jesus and think which ones are the most believable and which ones are the hardest to believe in. And he thought, well, if Jesus says someone heals, well, maybe it was a coincidence. That person was going to feel better anyways. Maybe if that person said they were possessed with a demon, it was just a mental health thing and they got better. And so it's kind of hard to tell if Jesus actually did something. What David Strauss did is, as he ranked all the different miracles, when he investigated this one, the water to wine, he actually put it at the top of his list. Water to wine is one of Jesus' greatest miracles. And as he explored it, he realized this. In the area where they were, and the story tells us in Cana, grapes don't grow in Cana. There are different regions of Israel where you can grow different things. Grapes do not even grow there. And the idea of water to wine suggests that you're going from nothing to something. There are going to be atoms and fermentation and things that would take months or years to happen, that Jesus can make it happen like this. And so when David Strauss thought about this miracle, he thought, this is actually more outstanding than someone else who, a blind man seeing, that could have been faked. That could have been faked. Someone could pretend to be blind. His eye is there anyways, and suddenly he can see. Maybe there was a way that was faked. But the water into wine, where at a large wedding there would be dozens or hundreds of guests, is not something you can fake. And so when he thought about this miracle, he actually thought it was quite amazing and would be the sign of a true creator God who could turn just water, H2O, into something, and a fine, excellent wine instantly. Well, I think that's also another layer of the glory, is to actually consider how great of a miracle happens here. The last thing I want to mention is that it is the fulfillment of God's glory. And where I want to point this out to you especially is in the Jewish toast. Now, different cultures, before I show it, also often say something before we drink. And so in North American culture, we might say a toast to the bride and a groom, and many, many people will toast the bride and a groom. For people of Chinese background, you might say yambui or ganbei, and you say that as a reminder before you drink your cup. Jewish people had a prayer before they drank the cup as well. And what Jewish people would say is this: "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who created the fruit of the vine." Lord, God, King of the universe, who created the fruit of the vine. Does this give you another sense of the layer of what Jesus did in turning water into wine? That Jews, before they take of the wine, we need to understand why wine is so important to Jewish people. Let's go back to Exodus. Jewish people do not have a land. They do not have freedom. They're slaves. They cannot enjoy the fruit of their own efforts or their land. Well, as God establishes them in the new land, they are promised that the land will be abundant, flowing with milk and honey. And a land has to be abundant for there to be wine. For you to be established in a place, not nomads or slaves, have fertile soil, to be able to grow grapes, not just bad grapes, good grapes, to harvest them, to put them in a barrel, to wait months or years in a peaceful land, and then to be able to drink wine. Wine for Israelites symbolized peace and prosperity of God. And so before they would toast, they would say, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who created the fruit of the vine." Jesus says in his miracle that he is in fact the Lord our God. Jesus is in fact the King of the universe. And who can create something from nothing? Jesus can, and he brings the fruit of the vine for them. And so as we saw in some of the passages, we heard from Isaiah, which Dorothy read to us. Let me read a couple more passages from Isaiah to help you understand this symbol of wine, of where wine stands in Jewish culture and faith. If we go back to Isaiah 24, this is sort of a prophecy of how bad things will be for Israel. The wine mourns, the vine languishes. All the merry-hearted sigh. No more do they drink wine with the singing. The wasted city is broken down. There's an outcry in the streets for lack of wine. You may not be that familiar with this passage. I think you will remember this one after this. There's an outcry on the streets for lack of wine. All joy has grown dark. The gladness of the earth is banished. Desolation is left in the city. The gates are battered into ruins, as when an olive tree is beaten, as at the gleaning when the grape harvest is done. Do you see that imagery of Israel as if Israel were a vine, but Israel as a vine will be barren? It will be as if every single grape had been beaten off of it, and there will be no fruit or joy from it. But although Israel goes through some very tough times, Isaiah then has promises of what will come. Come, everyone who thirsts, come to the waters, and he who has no money, come buy and eat. Come buy wine and milk without money, without price. And here we see that image of wine and milk as a symbol of abundance in God's blessing. And that all then leads into what was read earlier today. The nations shall see your righteousness. You shall be called by a new name, and that the mouth of the Lord will give. You shall be a crown of beauty. You shall no more be termed forsaken, but you shall be called, my delight is in her, and your land married. So here we see the image of wine into the image of marriage, and that's what's going on in this miracle of Cana, both the missing of the wine and now the joy of a marriage that as a bridegroom rejoices over his bride, so shall your God rejoice over you. That is the goodness of God, who will rejoice over us and bring this promised wine, this cup of salvation. In Epiphany, we're asking the question, who is Jesus? Jesus here, often, and I think in this overlooked miracle, shows that he is the creator who creates the fruit of the vine. He is Lord of the universe. But his miracle is not just a silly card trick. It comes from his love, both for his mother and then the blessing of these families. Jesus does something personal and meaningful for them. Well, the spot here is where, at our church, when married couples are married, they stand here. But this spot is not only just for weddings. It is also when we come and celebrate the Lord's Supper, remembering that Jesus brings us new bread and new wine. And on those Sundays, last week, and we will next week, when we celebrate Holy Communion, we remember Jesus' words to us. After supper, Jesus took the cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink this, all of you, for this is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins. Whenever you drink it, do this in remembrance of me." His body is broken for us, and his blood indeed is the cup of salvation. And he tells us one day we will drink it anew in heaven at the ultimate of wedding feasts, greater than the one at Cana. Glory be to God. Amen.